Shalom and welcome to this edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson, and for this session, we're going to do a topic called Christian Antisemitism. Now, for the next 5 sessions, today included, we're making a bit of a diversion from what I'm normally teaching here, and in that we're going into a very specific topic, and that's the topic of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which are similar but somewhat different. Anti-Semitism is feelings against the Jews. Anti-Zionism is against Israel. And in the 5th session, we're going to take a look at the Christian viewpoint of Israel according to the Bible, according to what God said. All right. Now, there's reasons I'm doing this, and mainly because of what's been happening, within the last year or two. But anyway, what I want to kind of give by way of background today, because we're looking at a topic that's very uncomfortable called Christian anti-Semitism, one that's not very well known. I'm going to give you a lot of information today it's going to be new. That's all there's to it. But it's important to understand so that we can have the bigger picture in really forming our opinions and knowing also what other people think. So I think it's very important. Again, I am a teacher, not a preacher. So my job is, as I view it, is to give information as best I can without being biased. We all have a bit of a bias, obviously, in our presentations, but I'm trying hard right here to just give the facts and information so that we can be well informed. But anyway, just by way of introduction, I first realized there was something going on with the whole idea of teaching the Jewish roots of Christianity many years ago. In my very first introduction session here, I kind of give a background as to how I got into understanding the background of the Bible, wanting to know the context. Generally, sometimes we call that the Jewish roots of the Bible because obviously they're Hebrew or later called Jewish roots to understand all of that background. In other words, Israel and the Hebraic ideas and the rabbis and how they taught, all of that. So anyway, back in the 90s, when I went to that session that I talked about, standing in the gap in D.C., I kind of give you that story as to how I got interested in this and the blowing of the shofar. I won't go back through all that again, but that's when it happened. Within a couple years, I really started to develop curriculum and getting ready to teach some of these ideas I was excited about. And I decided to bring it to the church I was going to, a large Nazarene church. And there's a reason I'm telling you this story really quick here. When I brought it I was going to bring it to my church and start a Sunday school class. The pastor and the assistant pastor wanted to meet with me, which is fine. They knew me well. I had served on the board and been in his church for a long time. So obviously we had a close relationship. But anyway, as I began to talk about what I'm going to teach, I started seeing resistance on both of their parts. They started asking me questions almost kind of like I was on trial. And rather than I initially thought they'd be excited like I was, they really weren't. And I wonder, what is that about? I don't get this. Why are they, really have this seem like this real resistance for me to teach the Bible with this Hebraic background? Well, like all of us, we have we have background teachings and ideas in our mind and concepts, and there was resistance for a reason, which I gradually understood. Now, I don't say that to condemn them at all, just to understand history and how that can work at times. And what I'm saying here will make sense as we go on. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this is after the incident of October 2023, October 7, 2023 in Gaza, this horrific incident here, where all of these little kibbutzim, they're called, you can see them listed to the side of Gaza, were attacked in an absolutely brutal fashion. There was things that happened I'm not going to discuss right now, but I think most of you have read about it and you heard about it. And it seemed to me that, the reaction of the world would be to be on Israel's side and obviously they're the ones who were attacked and to have sympathy. Well, that didn't last long for many people in many sessions here. I'm circling that city right there because I was there before the events of October in 2023, that Sederot town. And it's a very fascinating place. The kids had all been traumatized by missiles that had been shot at them. Gaza was pretty much Israel was forced to give it over to the Palestinians, and the Hamas eventually took over control. And we'll talk about this in the future sessions here, but missiles were fired into all parts of Israel. Anyway, that particular town was really traumatized. And that was one of the towns that was affected by this incredible incursion that came across the border of Gaza into all these kibbutz. Now, when the very first missiles, or the first missile that was talked about in the news, was a missile that actually was coming from Gaza, the pictures later showed, and it landed right on the side of a hospital in Gaza. And I saw the pictures of it, and it was very clear it came from inside Gaza, and it fell right within Gaza, it hit a hospital. Immediately, the world said Israel did it. Well, it was obvious to me that from the video and anyone looking at it, that's not what happened. It came from inside. But immediately what happened is the condemnation on Israel started right there. And my wife and I had a trip planned to go to Egypt, and that had to be canceled because in Cairo and really cities all over the world, people were in the streets protesting Israel, violently talking about the Jews in Israel, against them. So that happened immediately, and that seemed to trigger a whole lot of other lies, actually, about what was going on inside of Gaza. So rather than talking about, really focusing on, there was focus on it, but it kind of shifted to the what happened with this missile incident. But what I started to say is, rather than focusing on the horrors that happened to the Jewish people, it seemed like it shifted to Israel being the ones who were in the wrong. And the Gaza Health Ministry was run by Hamas. And unbelievably, our media and the media of the world took them as their source of information throughout the conflict. It was really stunning, and we'll get into a little bit of that later. So, and I think most of you know, it was a peace festival that was happening at that time. These were mainly young people, and they really wanted to have peace and with the Palestinians and with Hamas and all of them. That's what they were doing. But what happened is some of them lived on the kibbutzim in the area, and some just traveled in. But those who did live on these different kibbutzim, many of them had hired Palestinians from Gaza to work for them, to give them jobs. And many of them had taken them to hospitals, and they were doing lots and lots of things to try to help them. Now, the reason I put down there traders is because some of the people that actually worked for some of these Jewish families were the ones who came back to kill them. They had maps. They had details of exactly what each one of these areas looked like. And it was stunning when they saw the faces of the people killing them and torturing them. It was literally the people that they were trying to help. United Nations involvement turned out to be not good at all, and we'll get into more of that later, but they were very much often on the side of the Hamas. There was a total of 1,200 that died that day. Now, that would be, to kind of compare that to the United States, there's 7.5 million Jews in Israel. We have 345 million people in the United States. So that's a 50 times ratio. So to compare that to what that would look like in the United States, that's equal to 60,000 people being killed, okay, or 29 11s. So a massive event, obviously, in addition to all the people taken as hostage. And as I mentioned before, that missile that landed on the hospital really seemed to trigger the lies which began at that moment. Okay. And in the United States, anti-Semitism is on a massive increase right now. Jews represent 2% of the population. 70% of the hate crimes are against them. And that's true almost all over the world. Now, the term anti-Semitism, okay, just to look at that, because I'm using that term, was first coined by a guy named Wilhelm Marr in 1879. He was a German publicist and agitator, kind of somebody that went to the streets and tried to get things going. He founded the League of Anti-Semites and published a pamphlet entitled The Way to Victory of Germanism over Judaism, which popularized this term. Okay, so he invented a term as a slur against the Jews. Now, anti obviously means against. Now, Semitism refers to descendants of Shem. Now, it's actually really not even an accurate term at all, because you'll see right now why that's true. Historically, Shem was the forefathers of the Jews and the Arabs. Okay, the Semites or the Shemites, okay, later abbreviated the Semites, were Jews and Arabs both. But however, in the context of anti-Semitism, it specifically denotes hostility towards Jews. That's what it become to be known as. And this German guy kind of popularized this whole idea. Earlier usage, prior to Mar's usage, the term Judenhass, Jew hatred, was commonly used to describe anti-Jewish sentiments. Mar's introduction of anti-Semitism was intended to give a more scientific and systematic label to those prejudices, distinguishing it from a mere religious or cultural animosity. Now, I would kind of compare this. This is an attempt by an intellectual to take a group of people and demonize them and literally to give this title. I would compare it to Darwin's Origin of the Species, which is a well-known book and what happened there. The intellectuals that really came through the Enlightenment, but I'll get into all of that, but Marr was one of them, and so are these authors of this document, okay, Darwin and any others who were helping him. The full title of his book is The Origin of the Species and the Preservations of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Okay, now why am I mentioning that? Because this whole idea of this elitism and demonizing groups of people was very much an idea presented by some of the intellectuals of the time period. They tried to present themselves as superior. Now, within Darwin's book, part of the whole concept of his evolutionary theory is to create a superior race. Why certain groups of people are superior to others. Okay, so there's a big story behind all of that. Now, all right, really the proper term for Jewish hatred is, I wouldn't really say anti-Semitism is correct at all. I would say this is. All right, so let's look at this. This is Ezekiel. He said this, I will give you over to bloodshed. I will pursue you because you harbored an ancient hatred. And in Hebrew, olam haba, ancient or everlasting hatred is what it literally translates at, and declared the Israelites over to the sword. So probably the proper biblical term is ancient hatred. Okay, so it goes back to the very, very beginning. Now, Prophet Hosea said this, and I've mentioned this before. It's important for us to understand. We should have background knowledge, history knowledge of what's happened before. Hosea said, my people are destroyed from lack of knowledge, quoting what God is telling him. Okay, now obviously it's the Bible, but it's also all this information. It's important for us to be fully educated on these things. And from the very beginning, this is where this hatred started. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Now, you and the woman would be, you meaning Satan, and the woman represented Israel. So from the very beginning, this animosity was clearly here. So in other words, the ancient hatred or anti-Semitism, the ultimate source of it all is really clear. Satan. And I will come back to that over and over again because he has webbed himself through all of history, and there are certainly reasons for that. Now, in John, Satan, Jesus speaking here, was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and a father of lies. And the number one source against the Jews through all of history is very clear. It has been lies, and because of the source being the father of lies. Now, Abraham Lincoln, when he was asked the question during the Civil War, he was asked the question, do you think God is on our side? Okay. His answer was interesting. Lincoln said, what I want to be is on God's side. And I think that's really important. We always want to be on God's side. What did God say? And so that's going to be really the foundation behind this 5-part series, 5 or maybe eventually 6. We'll see what happens here. But that's what we want to know. All right. So if we want to do that, let's begin by thinking about, well, how does God view Israel. Okay, let's first look at that. Well, the scriptures tell us, for the eyes of the Lord reigns throughout the whole earth. Okay. For this is what the Lord Almighty says, after the glorious one has sent me against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. All right, now, what does that mean? Now, it's kind of a Hebrew idiom. The apple of his eye literally means the pupil. Remember, we learned that Hebrew is very much a picture language. It means his pupil. So picture this. His eyes are looking at the whole world. Okay, God's eyes, always. He's looking at us, wherever we live. But the pupil is right there, looking right at Israel. And there's lots of reasons for that. So if that's true, and we want to follow God, we need to have the same type of attitude, okay? And what this literally meant is a little man in his eye, which is the pupil, essential for vision. This whole idea, apple of his eye. Now, it's pretty clear why Satan is attacking this tiny little nation. And when people first go here, they're blown away how small it is. Half of it's desert. It's like, what in the world is this about? Why is the whole world talking about this tiny little country all the time? Well, it becomes very clear when we really look closely at this, because obviously God chose this for his covenant land. This is where his scriptures were written, all Jewish authors, probably all except for Luke. And this, of course, is where the Messiah come from. And Jesus was born Jewish. And I know that sometimes maybe Christians have a little bit of trouble with that, but it's obviously true. And all through the scriptures, we hear the idea of the God of Abraham and then God of Isaac and Jacob also. But that's 37 times in the Old Testament, 22 in the New, and that's always a reference to the covenant. The covenant was made with this nation right here, and we are part of it as Christians and followers of Jesus, or Yeshua, his Hebrew name, through this covenant with Abraham. Now, and of course, Jesus said, when he was talking to this Samaritan woman, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Okay. All right. Now, that obviously does not mean that all Jews are going to reap the benefit of this covenant if they have not put their trust in Jesus clearly. But what Jesus is saying here is salvation came through the Jews. Through the Jews. Okay. He made that totally clear. Now, let's get specifically into this. The divide begins. Where did this divide between Christians and Jews happen? Because initially, all the followers were Jews. 100%. All of them were Jewish. And if you read the book of Acts, you'll see how many of the Pharisees become followers of Jesus. So you had this Jewish movement, but somehow something happened to cause this divide. Now, in 70 AD is really kind of a landmark incident which began to really split these followers of Jesus, Jewish, and then the Gentiles who started coming in, beginning with Cornelius in that town on the seacoast, okay, called Caesarea, that incident with Peter. Some Jewish followers of Jesus interpreted this as the beginning of the end. They did not stay and fight. They were by heeding Jesus' words. Okay, now Jesus has said, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, many of them, followers of Jesus, Yeshua, didn't stay and help the other Jews. They left because they literally followed what Jesus said. Now, I think Jesus was referring to something in the future, but even beyond, but they interpreted this right then. So they went down into Jordan. The arrows are pointing down to a place called Petra. That's likely where they went. This is the entrance to Petra. It's an amazing place. Maybe we can do a session on that sometime. I've been there a few times. It's a really incredible spot. It's likely they went down into this area. All right, now moving on. Under Roman law, eventually, Judaism was legal and Christianity became illegal. Okay, this is what's going to happen over time here now. Christians were persecuted on a massive scale, especially, of course, in the Colosseum, where so many of them were used as sport to be killed in front of the Roman citizens by lions or other wild animals or by fights or whatever. So this happened. So there seemed to be this in the Roman Empire. They went after the Christians more actually than the Jews. Since the Jews were not persecuted nearly as great as the Christians, okay, now when I say Christians, I want to understand, let me be very clear, that word came out later. It means the followers of Jesus. And initially many of them were Jewish. And they still were during this time period. So kind of let me be clear about that. The term came from Antioch, Christos, but it refers to the followers of Jesus. Okay, more animosity developed through them. Later, when Christianity became the religion of Rome, retribution laws were passed. All right. So there were those over time who had animosity towards the Jews. Now, these are Jews who did not follow Jesus, okay, who remained, who were not considered to be followers of Jesus. They didn't go along that line. They said he's not the Messiah. So there's going to be this retribution eventually. Now, there's lots of things that happen, and I'm only touching on a tiny bit here. Nero, who was a total nutcase, the guy was a monster. He was just a lunatic. He persecuted Christians on a massive scale. He burned them alive as lights for his banquets. Put them up on big poles and set them on fire to give you an idea what a maniac this guy was. So there was massive persecution against Christians in the Roman Empire. Now, in AD 132, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, the Jews staged a revolt against Rome. Okay, now Bar Kokhba, a leader among the Jews, was proclaimed to be the Messiah by a rabbi named Rabbi Akiva, who was probably one of the most famous rabbis. But obviously, Jewish followers of Jesus, they could not join in this revolt because Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah. Jesus, Yeshua, was the Messiah. Okay, so that is going to cause a problem. Well, the Jews lost the revolt, and they were bitter. The Jews who had not followed Jesus were bitter against those who would not join. Hadrian banned all the Jews from Jerusalem except for one day a year, Tisha B'Av, which is the day that the temples were destroyed, and that's the way it's going to be for many, many years. The Jerusalem church could not continue, and Jerusalem was no longer the center of the Christian movement. It was initially. Hadrian made Jerusalem into a Roman city. This is a picture from today that I took where you can actually see the remnants of this time period in order to erase all Jewish connections. And now I mentioned this before, but Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina. Okay, so he's going to name it after Hadrian's middle name and a god, Jupiter. Israel becomes Syrio Palestina, and I've mentioned that before too, after the Philistines. All right, he's going to name them after their most hated enemy during Old Testament times. The Romans wanted to remove God's name forever. So there's going to be 3 new centers of Christianity. It's going to shift from Jerusalem, very important now, to Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, that's up in Syria, or up kind of on the Syrian edge of Turkey, and then Rome is going to be the other center. The church became increasingly non-Jewish and more Greek thinking over time. So over time, the followers of Jesus are going to lose their original source from that Jerusalem movement, the Hebraic origins, and become more Greek just by over time, by how they're what they're learning. Early church leaders and animosity towards the Jews. So we're going to look at this topic. This is a tough one. Now, these are some of the early church leaders famous in Christianity. Marcion was one of them. He lived way back during that time period, 100 to 160. He argued the Hebrew scriptures should be done away with since they were only allegorical, not literal. That's an argument we hear today a lot. Now, there is allegory in the Bible, obviously, and it's very clear to tell where that is. But to say the Bible is all allegorical is obviously a lie. The God of the Old Testament was a God of anger and hate, is what Marcion taught. The God of the New Testament was a God of love. So what he's doing is he's setting up this whole idea. The God of the Old Testament, well, that's that Jewish Hebrew God. He was angry. The New Testament, was the God of love. Like God totally changed. He metamorphosized into something totally different. Tertullian was another one. Even more of anti-Jewish writings. He was a contemporary of Marcion, lived during that same time period. He uses phrases like Vestus Testamentum, I didn't quite pronounce that right, which referred to Old Testament, and Novum Testamentum, which is New Testament. Okay, now, so in other words, he renamed what the Jews had called the Tanakh. All right, now the Tanakh was what we call the Old Testament, really based on what this guy did right here. We still use his renaming as a basis. But if like I've been in Israel many times, and when I refer to the Bible, I call it the Tanakh. And they look at me and they kind of smile because, that's what we have always called it. And that's what Jesus would have called it. The Torah, it's an acronym, the Tanakh. The T is for Torah. The N is for Nevi'im, which is prophets, and the Ketuvim, the K, is the writings. Okay. In the New Testament, initially, was called the Brit Kadashah in Hebrew. Brit is covenant, and Kadashah is renewed. So it'd be like the renewed covenant. So it's a different kind of picture. So in other words, the New Testament is the renewed covenant. It's the fulfillment of the Old Testament or the Tanakh. Okay. Now, I'm just giving you a lot of information here just so by way of background. Now, Justin Martyr was very important. The scriptures are not yours, but ours, is what he said. Okay, he's talking to the Jews. Beginning of the idea of replacement theology. This is huge, and it's still going on to this day. It always has gone on. The replacement theology means simply that God is done with the Jews. They blew it. It's over. And now he's replaced them with the Gentiles. Israel has no point anymore. It's over because they made a mistake. We'll talk about that a lot because it's so important. The Greek worldview was the physical and spiritual world, flesh and matter of the world, and the world is sheer evil. Okay, so some of this stuff is webbing into some of these early Christian leaders. That's what the Greeks viewed. The Jews justly suffer, and your cities burn with fire, and they are desolate, for you have slain the just one. Okay, so there's a lot of this coming out very, very quick. The Jews, of course, are being blamed, and they're being singled out. Origen was very important. A little bit later, he said, the Jews will never be restored to their former condition, for they have committed a crime of the most unhallowed kind. In conspiring against the Savior of the human race, they are cursed by God. And he popularized this statement right here. Let his blood be on us and our children. Now, because there were certain Jews who had said that, and we're going to look at that in just a second here because it's important to understand, because that phrase right there echoed through all of history. Origen and future Christian leaders applied that statement to all Jews. Okay, this statement right here, let his blood be on us and our children. And I want to look at that because it's very, very important. So let's go back to where that statement was made. So we're going back to Israel at the time of Jesus, and let's do that. Okay, a couple verses there. Then the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. He said a lot of things against leaders of Israel, as we've learned already. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left him and went away. So pretty clearly, the general population, the general crowd, they were afraid of him because they liked Jesus and they liked his teachings and they were following him around. Now, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again and offered Barabbas to be crucified. Okay. Now, what I'm going to want to do here is look at this idea. Where did this take place? Because this is important to understand. Okay. Now, where this took place, we now know, according to, I can't get into all the details because it's a very long story, but it took place in this palace right here. Okay, now not that palace, I'm sorry. That palace, or that actually fort, is where we first thought it took place. That's called the Antonia. That's the Roman fort. All right, so initially, that's where it was thought that this trial took place. It didn't. We now know it took place, I'm going to draw a line around it right here, in this incredibly beautiful palace, okay, which is right here. Today it was called Herod's Palace. That's where all the Pilate and all the chief guys, this is where they went. They didn't want to rub noses with just lowly Roman soldiers. They stayed in the elite spot. So this particular incident almost for certain took place right here. Now, why is that important? Well, let's look further into this. Now, by Jesus' own words, okay, what he said, when they were on their way to Jerusalem, the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. Who are they? Well, they are the leaders. They are the leaders of Israel. Those are the ones he talked against all the time. Okay, they would obviously be able to be in that palace because they were among the elites. They were the temple authorities. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles and will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. All right. As soon as the chief priests, now listen to the biblical account, and officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." Who's shouting? Chief priests and their officials, the temple authorities. Where were they? Almost for certain in a place the common people couldn't even go, Herod's palace. John refers to the chief priests and temple authorities and Jewish leaders as Jews. And this is one of the biggest reasons of confusion, that the fact that John did this. He referred, and this is again a long story to get into all details, but he did. I have details within my book about this. Those that want to read it, I've get into it in some depth. But he referred to them as Jews. The Jews, to John's reference here, were not all the common people, is these guys, the leaders. All right. Now, there's no reference in this discussion, in this particular incident, to oklos, which is the Greek word for multitude. But here's where there was a reference to a large multitude. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, remember that story? A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowd that went ahead of him and those that followed him shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Okay, very large crowd. Oklos, multitude. It doesn't say a large crowd in Herod's palace where they're going to, to hand him over and yell, "Crucify him." It does here. Okay, so there's a distinction that word isn't even used in this case. So where the words, now I'm said all that to get back to this, because these words echoed through all of history and the result in the death of countless Jews, which is just incredible. "Let his blood be on us and our children." All right. And of course, Jesus said, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord." So Jesus is clearly saying that he allowed himself to be crucified and of course resurrected because of this mission that he had to accomplish here for our salvation. And this is so very important to understand because the Jews of all time they're constantly going to be called Christ killers. "Let his blood be on us and our children" is going to be yelled in their faces at all times. Now, it doesn't mean that all the Jews eventually accepted him. They didn't. But actually, a fair number did, as we know from reading the book of Acts. And to paint them all, we're all guilty of Jesus' crucifixion, as he made it clear, because we've all sinned. Okay. Now, I wanted to get that out there because it's so important to understand what's going to happen through the rest of history here. Now, in 306, Constantine, a very important Roman emperor, became the first Christian, and I put it in quotes because it's somewhat debatable here, Roman emperor. In 321, Christianity became the official religion, ending the years of persecution of Christians. In 312, Constantine built the first church back before he was even Roman emperor. From the time of Jesus until then, the first Christians were worshiping in synagogues. All right, so there's going to be some big changes made. So Christianity is almost going to become like a state religion. And so this gradual taking away this Jewish roots or Hebrew roots of worshiping in synagogues and all of that type of thing is going to keep changing, and now on a greater scale yet, as Rome kind of becomes the church of Christianity. So as we move ahead in 315, the Edict of Milan said Jews could be burned as punishment. Ancient privileges will be withdrawn. Proselytism became illegal. Jews could not hold higher offices or serve in the military. So this persecution just kept going. Council of Nicaea The Sabbath became Sunday, the Passover became Easter, and the date was set the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, which is kind of a complicated setup. We actually still use that today. John Chrysostom, who came a little bit later in 347 to 407 in Antioch, he was based. He was nicknamed Golden Tongue because he was a great orator. He ordered Christians had to stop observing the feasts, the Sabbath, that kind of thing, to observe the true faith. So in other words, what he's doing is stomping on even more of that original background, the so-called Hebrew roots of the scriptures, those holidays, which each had very important meanings. Okay, now it doesn't mean that Christians need to follow all those today, but what's going on here, and I want to mention this, is there is meaning in all of those festivals, and he's going to stomp this out like there's no connection whatsoever. Whereas Jesus, taught something very different. He delivered 8 famous sermons against the Jews. He was a very famous person who's very anti-Semitic or showing this ancient hatred. He said the synagogue is not only a brothel and a theater, it is also a den of robbers and a lodging for wild beasts. Nice. No Jews adore God. Jews are invertebrates, murderers, possessed by the devil. Their debauchery and drunkenness gives them the manners of the pig. They kill and they maim one another. So obviously this whole thing is going down incredibly down a lane that's ridiculous. These people have literally, in a sense, almost lost their mind by following this hate and repeating each other. He referred to them as Christ killers. I have said enough against those who say they are on our side. They are eager to follow the Jewish rites. It is against the Jews that I wish to draw up the battle. The Jews are abandoned by God. And for the crime of deicide, which that is what he's talking about, Christ killer, this whole idea, let his blood be on us and our children, there is no expiation possible. In other words, it's hopeless. All of them are going to hell according to him. Now, examples of so-called Christian art, now the reason I put it in quotes is because are in fact all of these people and ideas Christian? Well, I would say we simply weigh it based on what Jesus said, who his followers are, and then we make that evaluation. I'm not going to make that evaluation here, but you can for yourself. Examples of so-called Christian art through the periods of history which demonstrate hatred for the Jews. All right. Now, synagoga was always a reference to, obviously, to the Jews, ecclesia to the Christians. So through history, there was a lot of art to represent the two. So look closely here at synagogue. It was defeated. Her staff is broken in 2 places. The Torah is slipping from her hands. You can see that. A veil covering her eyes. Her head is bowed. She's sad. She's broken. She's defeated. And then we have ecclesia. She's triumphant. Crown, imperial robe, staff, and chalice in her hand, representing divine authority. She looks ahead, assured of her mission in the world. So art is going to represent all of this hatred towards the Jews from the so-called Christian viewpoint. This is in a church in Germany, a wood carving, and it's pretty vicious, showing this vision of the Christianity literally carrying a sword going against Jews, okay, and synagogue being broken and beaten, and you can see the pig down there to demean the Jews. Obviously, we know that that's unclean, and to associate that with Jews is really a tremendous insult. Ecclesia has this lance. She's on a horse, and she's attacking synagogue. So this is awful stuff, okay? And synagogue eyes are closed, and she's riding on a pig. Her left hand is holding a branch. Justinian, 527 to 565, forbade Jews to celebrate Passover, put guards next to synagogues to prevent them from saying the Shema. That's the very most important verse in the scriptures that Jesus confirmed. Okay. Pope Gregory, and there are many of the popes who very, very strongly went against the Jews. Pope Gregory made the papacy the supreme authority, forbade Christians from eating with Jews or observing the Sabbath. Okay, restrictions continue and increase. By the middle of the 8th century, Pope Zachary, another pope, enforces the edict of no intermarriage of Jews and Christians. By the late 930s, Pope Leo VII ordered all Jews who would not convert to Christianity to be exiled. Edicts everywhere to ensure Jews would always remain inferior in work opportunities, especially compared to the Christians. So it just keeps going. Pope Urban II, okay, now we're into the Middle Ages, ordered the Crusaders to the Holy Land. En route to the Holy Land, the Crusaders did wipe out many Jewish towns. When they entered Jerusalem, they attacked the Muslims as well as the Jews. Now, this is a complicated topic, the Crusades, and I'm not going to get into that here because it's just way too long, but were they justified in any sense, the Christians coming into this area? Certainly in the sense of trying to reclaim all the Christian holy sites that the Muslims had totally conquered. And that obviously was justification. But in terms of how it all came down, there were some things that were not justifiable. Okay? Here's one of them. The Jews sought refuge in their synagogues as these Christian armies came in. History records at least one of these synagogues was set on fire as the Crusaders sang, "Christ, we adore thee." Okay, I think that speaks for itself. Okay, so pictures like this from the Crusaders. The idea of the cross was going to have a meaning to the Christians, but a very, very different meaning to the Jews. Now, it's important for us to understand all this history because it's embedded within the Jews, this whole history. So the cross, for many of them, represented death at the hands of, in this case, the Crusaders or other people during history. Then something came up called the blood libel, another massive lie of Satan. In a medieval Europe myth that led to the death of countless Jews. And here's the story. A young boy, according to this, it's a lie, a young boy named William of Norwich was found murdered. Okay, that was true. And a monk named Thomas of Monmouth falsely accused the local Jewish community of his murder, claiming it was a ritualistic act mimicking the crucifixion of Christ. So he made this up. That did not happen. The death happened, but not the other. The Jewish community did not do that. And the myth is this. The Jews capture and murder Christian children, like this incident, and they're going to keep doing this, to use the blood for their religious rituals, particularly Passover. If you can imagine that kind of a lie. But it was all over the place. It's called the blood libel. And so many Jews died in the name of the blood libel, which is a complete lie. Again, at the hands of Satan through human instruments that bought into this garbage. The 1300s Black Plague, you probably heard of that before, bubonic plague, which just wiped out probably a third of Europe, died. Jewish deaths were way lower than that. Okay, and a lot of that was probably because of their dietary habits and their cleanliness. But because the Jewish deaths were way lower, they were blamed for the Black Plague. Suddenly they're saying, well, the Jews are obviously doing this because they're not dying in the same numbers. And they said the Jews are poisoning the wells, and they're the ones doing it. So there was mass slaughter and burning of Jews during this time period. It just seemed like it kept getting worse and worse and worse through history. Lies upon lies upon lies. The father of lies never stops. The Inquisitions, centered in Spain. Okay, during that time period, there was forced baptisms of the Jews. They had to denounce their Judaism. Jewish homes were watched at all times. Any violations for heretical practices, like failure to eat pork, so they were forced to do this, okay, against their religion. Work on Sabbath, keeping biblical feasts, saying Jewish prayers associated with non-baptized Jews. They were watched like hawks, and during this, if they were caught doing any of those things, they were tortured. If the heresy was renounced publicly, the church would show mercy by strangling them before burning them. I know it sounds incredible, but this is all historical fact. If they confessed and they did not repent, they were burned alive. If they did not confess, even if they were innocent, they were tortured until they confessed, and many of them burned. Money from dead Jews went to the Roman Catholic Church, even had trials for dead Jews. Many of the Jews were put on trial with their bones, found guilty. And a lot of this money was put into the accounts of the Roman Catholic Church. This is some really bad history here, obviously horrific history, but it's all true. The Jews in Venice, Italy, were confined to the area of an old metal foundry called the ghetto, original term of the later called the ghetto. They could only be money lenders. This is important. They restricted the Jews to only being money lenders because it was considered to be a dirty job. And they could not own property. By Christian law, you could not be charged interest. Okay. Now, whenever they left the ghetto, they were required to wear a yellow badge on the left shoulder. The Jews were watched constantly. Now, Hitler reinstated the ghetto during his reign of terror. Hitler learned about a lot of this history, and this was the badge that he used. It was based on this, carried through history. Hitler used this for the idea these are some small children with this on their coats. And you can see the horror in their eyes right here. So history is so important to understand. This is the Warsaw Ghetto. Many of you heard about during World War II, which was where many of the Jews did this incredibly brave thing of trying to stand up to Hitler, which of course was going to be ultimately impossible. Now, this is one most people don't know about at all, and it's probably the most important of all, Martin Luther. Now, everybody knows who he was and what he did, okay? But I want to tell you about something you may not know that is important. Now, I'm not defaming his whole life, but you need to know this because it's so important. In his 1523 essay, that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, Luther condemned the inhuman treatment of the Jews and urged Christians to treat them kindly. Luther's fervent desire was that Jews would hear the gospel proclaimed clearly and be moved to convert to Christianity. So he started off really good. He was, tired to hear about all this horrific stuff that happened to the Jews, and he had this perspective. Okay, unfortunately, something happened here. Very few Jews became Christians. Now, Martin Luther was probably a type A person, I would assume, and that made him frustrated and angry. And over time, he became very, very frustrated. And I don't think he knew the whole history of all of it. Maybe he did. I'm not sure, but I'm kind of assuming he didn't understand this whole long history of what's behind all this. Because history is almost kind of like transferred from one generation to the other in so many ways through the parents. All right. Now, what happened here then was absolutely devastating. Because what happened with Martin Luther is he flipped. Did he ever flip? He wrote this book right here. This book was such an important thing that happened. It was so devastating. It's actually a picture of the original book, but it translates On the Jews and Their Lies. He wrote it in 1542. What's in this book? What's in it? It was devastating. I'm going to list a couple things. Now listen closely here. First, set fire to their synagogues and schools. And some of this he's repeating ancient anti-Semitic tropes from the past that you've heard. Their houses should be razed and destroyed. Their prayer books and Talmudic writings, that's the extra writings, should be taken from them. Their rabbis should be forbidden to teach henceforth on the pain of loss of life and limb. Safe conduct should be abolished completely for Jews. All cash and treasure of silver and gold should be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. I command putting a flail or an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. All right. Now, Hitler cited Luther. Adolf Hitler cited Luther in Mein Kampf. And he marked the 450th anniversary of Luther's birthday in November 1933 with a nationwide German Luther Day. Hitler is going to use a lot of these teachings against the Jews. Modern Jewish education emphasizes a link between Luther, Hitler, and the Holocaust and Jesus. Okay, now that's important to understand for us to understand the bigger picture today. The great masses of people more easily fall victim to a big lie than to a little one. Of course, that's what Hitler said, and he did it over and over again. He just repeat the big lie. Of course, we have that going on today, too. Hence today, I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator by defending myself against the Jew. I am fighting for the work of the Lord. Hitler said that, and he's basing it on a lot of what Luther wrote. Nothing new, but on a grander scale. They are the killers of Christ. They must be controlled and segregated, wear distinguishing badges, should only do menial tasks and barred from advanced studies, synagogues burned, prayer books destroyed, and obviously eventually killed. So he's citing all this. All right. Christian support. The foundation of this institute is based on the conviction that the Jewish influence in all areas of German life, including, therefore, that of the church and the religion, must be brought to light and eliminated. Now, Christian support of Hitler and his whole ideas against the Jews, that happened in Germany, and this is an example of it right here. Only 20% of the Lutheran Church would not bow down to Hitler. That was it. The other 80% did a lot of what Hitler wanted them to do in order to stay in their churches. This picture right here is a story that was become pretty well known. It's a small church where a Holocaust train went by it, and it seemed like it went by every Sunday when they were in church. And a lot of times they would be singing. And when it went by, it was hard for them to even hear each other singing because the train was loud, and they could hear the screams of the victims on the train, just screaming out for help. So the story goes that within the church, when the train would go by and they couldn't hear themselves singing very well, they would sing louder and louder and louder, just sing as loud as they could so they couldn't hear the screams. Now, I don't even have to make a commentary on that. I think that speaks for itself. Okay. And this type of thing happened, and it had a massive impact. Now, this is a Holocaust museum in Jerusalem. It's called Yad Vashem, which means a place and a name. I just want to look at a couple things here. And this is right on the outside of the Holocaust Museum. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation, so that Israel's name is remembered no more. And of course, that was what the world was trying to do. And the world is still trying to do that to this very day. This is inside, okay? And what this is just piles and piles of shoes from the victims as they were thrown into the gas chambers. Whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. This is Jesus speaking. Brothers of mine. What does he mean by that? Well, he's referring to his fellow Jews and those who follow him, okay? These are eyeglasses, just piles and piles of eyeglasses. Walking to this Holocaust museum is incredible. I don't think you can go through it with a dry eye because it's so devastating to see the physical remnants of what happened here. So these are eyeglasses of all victims, people thrown into the gas chambers of these horrific camps. In this picture here, so God formed man in his own image. Now we know that, all man in his own image. Sociologists estimate that had the Jews not endured all the persecution through history, their population would have been well over 200 million today, but there's only 15 to 17 million left today. Now, this is a children's memorial. This is, to me, the most, the saddest and the most devastating and consequential thing you could do in walking through this Holocaust memorial area is to go down. It's literally a cave. You walk down into this cave, and it's a memorial to the children. 1.5 million children were killed in the Holocaust. Every few seconds, a name is read, and you can just hear it on the loudspeaker. As you're walking down, you have to hold a rail. You're going down, it's dark, and you look up, and what you're seeing in the ceiling is every single little light up there represents one of those 1.5 million children. It is so devastating. It is so difficult. And you hear the names, and you think, what is God's heart? How did this happen? It's truly incredible. And I think by the time you walk out of this and you realize that words can't really, I can't put the words to it. It takes 3 months to read all the names. Isn't that incredible? So what the time I was in there, the times I've been in there a couple of times, there's only a few names read, and it goes on for 3 months to get the 1.5 million children who died. All right. Now, many Christians did stand up and paid the ultimate price. So it's not all bad. There were Christians who did stand up during this time period, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who made this famous statement: silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. This is the grave of Oskar Schindler. It's right outside the old city of Jerusalem. I took a picture of it here. You can see the stones. Those stones represent families who are putting their stones on there. Families who are alive today because of him, because of the lives he saved. There's a Jewish expression: to save one life is to save the world. Every life he saved, he didn't save one life. He saved all those generations that followed from that one life. And this is really quite a place to visit. And I think many of you know the story of Oskar Schindler. This is really important here. I've mentioned a couple examples, and what I've covered in here, just to mention, is barely the tip of the iceberg of what actually happened. I've barely even begun to discuss all of these horrific details, but I'm just giving examples. The Roman Catholic Church did some things that were definitely regrettable. But for example, one of those in 1948, they wouldn't even recognize Israel as a country. This man right here, Pope John Paul, he grew up in Poland. He had Jewish friends. He had Jewish friends that were killed in the Holocaust. He had a big heart for the Jews. And what he put in the wall right there, I'm going to go back just for a second. See this? This is in the Western Wall in Jerusalem, right beneath what was once the temple. And the prayer he put in the wall, let's read it together. Let's look at it. It's really important. It says this: God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who, in the course of history, have caused these children of yours to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. He put this in the wall, January 26, 2000. Wow, how powerful was this? And how powerful it was to the nation of Israel to know this Pope, John Paul, had done this. All right. And even since then, over the last 40, 50 years, Christian support seems like it's grown a whole lot. A lot of Christian scholars have gone over there and studied with the Jewish scholars, and unlocking a lot of these Second Temple records is teaching us more and more about the background of the Bible, which is really cool. But I have to report also that recently, really in the last couple of years, there's been a trend the other direction among many Christians. And I'm not going to get into that right here, but I think many of you have heard about this, where they're kind of reverting back in spite of these great gains that were made. Now, why? Why is all this going on? Is there a bigger story going on? Of course, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. That from the very beginning, Satan is continually going after the woman, which is Israel. And this was the original prophecy. Well, that concludes this first of 5-part sessions on this topic. And I want to thank you for watching. I know this is a very difficult topic. I should mention also that clearly there were people throughout in the Protestant and Catholic Church who did not follow suit with all this anti-Semitism, who did stand up for the Jews. The purpose of this session was to inform us of what did happen to Jewish people in terms of this anti-Semitism and how it was webbed throughout history. So for my wish for you is that you might experience the shalom that Jesus wants to give, and that we might all as Christians be compelled to have a heart for Israel and to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Shalom.